Okay.
Hello. If you can hear me, clap once. Hear me, clap twice. The old organizer trick. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you, Mark Luton, for opening up Guardian Cafe. Thank you, Holden, for holding down the bar over there. Oh, that was fun. Thank you for being here, everybody. My name is 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙾𝙾, and I'm a longtime reproductive rights advocate and social justice activist here in Dallas. And for many years, eugenics has come up for me a lot, and it's never one that I've been able to really discuss. It's just a really difficult and confusing topic, and I just didn't have tools for it. However, the authors tonight have never shied away from any difficult issues, and they've won multiple awards for their efforts. Michael Phillips, of course, wrote the definitive book on Dallas racism, White Metropolis, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion in Dallas, 1841 to 2001. I still refer to that book. I'm not kidding. I really refer to it at least twice a week now. And Betsy has decades of journalism experience at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and beyond. I know that they have written a book that is going to be one of the most important books of the year, and one that is long overdue. And I know it's going to be a book that we are going to be referring to for a really, really long time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really so honored to introduce Michael Phillips and Betsy Friauf.
All right. I've said this at other events, and I mean it. I always think a successful event is when the audience outnumbers us, and this is a much bigger crowd. And before I get into the main event, I just want to note that some really important people in the history of human rights, civil rights are here. 𝙏𝙼𝙚𝙖𝙨, who is with Human Rights Dallas. Jerry Hawkins, who's a major leader. What's the name of the group you're with now? There we go. All right, very good. Stephanie Drenka has started an Asian American History Center in Dallas. She's there. Melissa Pricer is very important to local Dallas history. We have Suzanne York, who took one of the photos in our book, and she should be applauded. Excellent, talented, someone who's just finished her PhD studying education and disability. And Linda Evan is a major human rights leader. And Charles Wright, Charles Hermes, who is a major person standing up for free speech and other issues, and paid the price, actually got arrested for daring to applaud during a Tarrant County Commissioner's Court meeting. That's the time we live in. Now, I like to ask questions rather than just going into a speech. And so I want to gauge what you know about the topic of the book. I assume you know a little bit. And so if you've heard me speak, hold back. Don't be like Lisa Simpson and say, I know. So I'm going to open by just asking a basic question. What is eugenics? Anyone know? You came out here not knowing what the topic was.
There's a hand.
Okay, Jerry, you know?
Race science.
Race science. Okay. Anything more particular than that?
The science is selectively breeding for whatever you want.
There we go. All right. Going back to ancient times, people noticed that they could breed cattle to produce more beef. They could breed dogs to herd sheep. And very early on, they said, well, maybe we can do that to breed specific humans with certain specific traits that we admire and want to be broadly shared in the human population. So intelligence, they thought maybe character, work ethic, honesty. They thought, and this is particularly, it picks up steam in the late 1800s and really becomes mainstream in the early 20th century, that all these traits were biological. And so there are two ways you can achieve those goals. One is getting the supposedly fit to have large families. And all over the world, countries ranging from the Soviet Union to the fascist dictatorship in Argentina and so on, try to provide incentives for so-called fit people, supposedly more intelligent, racially superior people, to have big families. And we really never had a comprehensive program in the United States for that. People said maybe we should give the fit families tax breaks for larger families. And by the way, if any of this sounds familiar, you might read about what Elon Musk and J.D. Vance, et cetera, are talking about fertility. There are actually families, or not families, but there are conferences taking place in Austin. We've had a couple of conferences promoting fertility for the fit in the last 3 years. One cost $10,000 a seat to attend, by the way. So that's what's called generally positive eugenics, getting the fit to reproduce. The other is much more horrifying and sinister, and that's called negative eugenics, which involved a lot of things. In the United States, particularly, the forced sterilization of people who were unfit. In the 19th century, that would involve castration of men. In later on, early 20th century, it'd be surgical removal of the testes, but also vasectomies, women hysterectomies, tubal ligations. The state would order these operations to take place, and people would be confined, and the targets were generally prisoners. They were people of color, poor whites, working class whites, and people who displayed unconventional politics. And they would be institutionalized. In Mississippi, it became so common that it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. And the targets were black women. And you may have heard of one of the victims of that sterilization, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was very deeply involved in the Voting Rights Act activism there. Now, so that's what eugenics is. The culmination, of course, the ultimate extreme example is the genocide that took place in Nazi Germany. And you should know this about your history. The Nazis, in every part of their ideology, were influenced by the British and the Americans. The segregation laws inspired the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the racial laws that made it a crime for Jewish and non-Jewish people to marry or have sex or have children together. The ghettos established for Jews in Europe were based on the segregation laws in the United States. They were inspired in eugenics as well. And in fact, the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all these American corporate donors funded Nazi eugenic research. IBM provided the computer database with punch cards during the Holocaust, the years leading up to the Holocaust. So now let me ask you another question. What is the legal status of these sterilization laws? Are these laws constitutional? The last Supreme Court decision regarding sterilization laws, 1927, Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was a woman from a poor Virginia family who was raped by a relative and got pregnant and was institutionalized because she had been sexually abused earlier. And so they thought she's mentally defective. And one of the criteria for who's unfit was supposed sexual promiscuity. And so they slated her to be forcibly sterilized. And she got attorneys to represent her. The case went before the United States Supreme Court. And the Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion. and describing the Buck family, which had been institutionalized in previous generations. He said, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. We are going to be swamped with incompetence if we allow Carrie Buck and her family to reproduce. And so they authorized the sterilization. Later, they evaluated her, and she was of normal intelligence. She's a victim of sexual abuse. The Buck versus Bell decision has never been overturned. Supreme Court's last word. Now, this sometimes gets people. Where in the country do you think most of the sterilizations took place? People always say that. You're wrong. Top place was the Pacific Coast. And way beyond any other state, more than 20,000 victims of forced sterilization was California. The 2 biggest places were all the Pacific Coast states. You know, Alaska wasn't a state during the wave of this movement, the height of this movement. But California overwhelmingly led. There were more than 60,000. So a third of the forced sterilizations we know about were in California. The other cluster was in the Midwest. Indiana is going to pass the first sterilization law in 1907. And I'll ask you, 1937 was the last state to pass the sterilization law. 1937 was Georgia. But overwhelmingly, the southern states didn't tend to participate. The exceptions were, I mentioned Mississippi, and it was specifically black women. Virginia was a big sterilization state, and Georgia. Now, this might be interesting to you. Did Texas pass a sterilization law? What did you say?
What is the sterilization law?
A law is where the courts are allowed and doctors are allowed to recommend and the courts are allowed to order someone to undergo forced hysterectomy, forced vasectomy. Actually, Texas was one of 12 states that never passed a sterilization law. And so this was the mystery, because we were like you, right? Southerners are going to do this. Texans are going to love this idea. Why the hell wouldn't Texas do it, right? I mean, it fits with all our history, the lynching and everything. No, actually, absolutely not. Now, Texas debated it, and before anyone else did, we found a doctor, Gideon Lincecum, who was in, roughly central Texas, who was a surgeon. And of course, people had minimal medical training back then to become doctors, right?
Is this the 1850s?
In the 1850s. He is going to write a vast number of letters, 600 letters to legislators, doctors in the state, members of the general public, leading figures, newspapers, urging the passage of a sterilization law. And he said, if we start castrating alcoholics, gay men, if we start castrating people with mental defects, people with insanity, and if we actually encourage the fit, he didn't use that term, but the best bred to have big families, he said in 15,000 years, we're going to have a super race. And does this sound familiar a little bit? Yeah, right. 15,000 years if we do this. The legislature laughed its proposal out of the they referred it to the cattle breeding committee. And it really made him angry. So it didn't pass. Rejected. They thought this is impractical. How no one's going to agree to this. It's cruel. It's unusual. Strangely enough, Texans said that. That was in the 1850s. The term eugenics wasn't even coined until 1883. Eugenics is from Greek. It means good in birth. And the man who coined the term was named Francis Galton. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And he's the man who coined the phrase, the survival of the fittest. Darwin never said that. Yes, I've got a... Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm a loud talker, but sometimes I forget them. So we have, in the 1880s, the Texas Medical Journal really advocating for sterilization laws. Then 1907, they proposed a bill. It fails. 1913, they debate a bill. It fails. 1913, also, they say, let's expand mental health facilities and we can lock these unfit people in hospitals where they're sexually segregated, they won't reproduce. That bill failed. 1915, they did expand the mental health hospitals for eugenic purposes. Then we have a pause. 1915 also, they proposed this. There was a proposed ban to prohibit supposedly unsightly people who are disabled from going to public spaces. And there was a term for this, and other states passed this. These were called ugly laws. Texas rejected that. 1923, there's a bill where this woman from Dallas, Edith Wilmans, first woman in the state legislature, who in a lot of histories is praised as a groundbreaking feminist. Well, guess what? She was also a eugenicist. She proposed, and by the way, I'll talk about this in a second, but the feminist movement was often very positive about eugenics. 1923, she proposes a marriage bill. Married couples have to undergo extensive examination before they get a marriage license. That got rejected. Then finally, last two times, 1935, 1937, 10 bills proposed in Texas, 9 failed.
What's the one?
The hospital, expanding the hospitals in 1915. Now, so here's the question. That was, we had to write a history when I became fascinated by this issue. And I became fascinated because when I was writing White Metropolis, I came across a news story, the Dallas Morning News, about how there was a Better Baby contest at the State Fair of Texas. And we'll talk about this in a second. But these were held across the state, and it was a feature of the State Fair every year. Fitter Family Contest, Better Baby Contest. And there was a UT professor, a psychology, or actually an education professor, who spoke and said, Texas babies are better than babies anywhere in the world, and all you fit people need to have big families. And so I said, well, there's a movement, but it didn't succeed in terms of legislation, even though it shaped the culture. So here's the question: why? And so we've identified a few reasons, and that's the main part of the book.
No spoilers here now.
Okay. Number one.
Oh, he's going to give the spoilers.
Number one. And getting there is the point, not the destination, but the journey, right? So, eugenics did well in California. It did well in some of the Midwestern states. It did well in states where if there wasn't a large Catholic population opposing eugenics, and if there was a lot of investment in higher education. And this will shock you, but during the time period from the 1850s where it's first discussed until 1940s when the movement kind of goes underground and begins to peter out, Texas had a lot of contempt for higher education and professors. We've grown past that, obviously, right? No, I mean, you see Sam Houston saying, we need border defense with Mexico and with the Native Americans. We don't need money on colleges and universities. We had legislators calling universities basically a place for silk stocking aristocrats. the children of the rich, doctors, and they're training doctors and lawyers. They're going to overcharge us. And so there was a lot of class resentment. And by the way, the upper class, the wealthy, did mean ill intent, did hold ill intent for the poor and the working class. And so politicians were able to tap into that populist rage against the upper class, because the upper class did exploit and saw the poor and the working class, not just people of color, but working class whites, as inferior. And they wanted to castrate them. So the funding for the universities was always inadequate. Censorship was always intense. You also, by the way, had greed. I said that a good result, the fact that Texas didn't pass the sterilization law, happened for the worst of reasons. And one of the reasons was that the eugenicists were very anti-immigration. The immigrants they were mostly worried about were coming over in the millions from the 1880s to start of World War I, were from Eastern and Southern Europe. Italians, Greeks, Croats, Russians, Poles, etc. Jewish immigrants. These were seen as not quite white people. They were a different racial category, somewhere in between white and black, but not really white, and they were inferior. So a congressman from East Texas, or from Crockett, Texas, that's East Texas, named John Box, was a major force getting an immigration bill passed in 1924 that imposed quotas on Eastern and Southern Europe, the harshest immigration law ever passed by the United States, a law that Stephen Miller, you may have heard of him, really admires and wants a new. He failed, though, in one major priority. He wanted immigration from Mexico closed down. And guess what? He faced fierce opposition because those Texas landowners wanted Mexican immigration. And why did they want that? They could pay them less. They worked in the factories, they worked in the fields. You had this, you had poor whites, African Americans, and the Latinx community working in the fields together, picking cotton, etc. And they wanted the floodgates open. They said, we don't have to worry, because the eugenicists are saying all these inferior people, they'll reproduce, they'll overthrow white civilization. They said, are you kidding? They're not capable of overthrowing white civilization. They're so backwards, we have nothing to worry about. A couple other reasons real quickly, and I'll kick it over to Betsy, and we'll take questions. The 1920s, which is when eugenics nationally is reaching its peak, is when Texas basically becomes the Bible Belt. A lot of people don't know this, but there were proposals to ban alcohol, the sale, distribution, transportation of alcohol in the 19th century. And Texans voted it down because they said that would be church and state uniting. We can't have that. And they would use the example of the Vatican. Look what happened with the Inquisition. It's terrible when church and state, the walls eroded. They said, look at those Muslim countries. What a terrible thing when you have a union of church and state. It was really on the prohibition issue, which gained momentum, of course, during World War I, that the fundamentalists became really politicized, and they began to win, and they won statewide in the prohibition issue. And they're anti-Darwinists, and the eugenicists were believers in Charles Darwin and evolution. It sort of is a necessity, to the theory, right? And then I would just say, finally, that we had one last element of the population. By the second decade of the 20th century, 13% of the Texas population is Catholic. And the Catholic, we actually found a priest that was an advocate of sterilization in San Antonio during the teens. And the church didn't have a definite position on eugenics, until 1930. And then Pope Pius issues, they issue letters that are called encyclicals, where they state doctrine. And Pius came out definitively against eugenics in 1930. The Catholic population was mobilized. They flooded legislators with letters when sterilization bills came up. They wrote, Governor Allred was governor during one of the bills, and they became an important swing vote in a lot of Texas districts, obviously in South Texas. Okay? So those are the major reasons why it failed. Now, one last point I want to make. Doesn't mean that the eugenics movement didn't shape the culture. We had the Better Baby contest, the Fitter Family contest. People were taught eugenics in their high schools and their biology texts. That was part of the curriculum. There was a 1915 movie that drew big audiences in Texas called The Black Stork that was based on a real story. A Chicago doctor convinced parents of a severely disabled newborn to leave their child exposed to cold and let the baby die. And he got put on trial for murder in Cook County, which is very Catholic. And the jury found him not guilty. And then a couple of years later, in 1917, he played himself in the movie The Black Stork. It's a silent film. And this was shown all over Texas. And newspapers were writing rave reviews and saying, you got to see this film. It was held over for days in several cities. So it really did get accepted as culture. What made it fall? It never fell. Eugenics movement never went away. And in the later 20th century, after World War II, after the Holocaust, when eugenics was supposedly discredited, they began to say, well, we're not going to use the word eugenics, but we don't want the certain people to have large families because they can't afford them. And our population's too big. We want zero population growth. Have you ever heard that phrase? Yeah. Sierra Club endorsed an idea of that's widely distributed contraceptives because of overpopulation, because it causes pollution. The environmental movement embraced this. You began to have politicians say women who get welfare should receive Norplant, which is a contraceptive implant, and so on. So that's our book, basically. There are things worth reading in the book. I gave a lot of it away. Betsy, would you like to?
Well, thank you all for being here. Give yourselves a hand. Oh.
The alligator Alcatraz? You know what your senator, John Cornyn, said? He'd like to have alligator Alcatraz in Texas. They'll have to import the alligators, I guess. No, but the anti-immigrant politics, the language, would you agree, is almost identical.
Yeah.
The language used to describe the immigrants.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is, we have a president who says that people are bringing bad genes to this country, and shithole countries.
Poisoning the blood of our country.
Yeah, and by the way, that poisoning the blood phrase was a Hitler phrase. Right, right. We've had mass expulsions, by the way, during the 30s. During the Depression, they expelled large numbers of Latinx people from the country. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll be happy to take your questions. And thank you so much for that. That's very pertinent nowadays, unfortunately. And I just want to thank Reform Dallas for organizing this. Let's have a hand for them, please. And thank you to the Garden Cafe for hosting us. Yes, and please feel free to go get more eats and drinks, and be sure to tip generously. So, questions?
Yes.
Who made these decisions? I mean, was it like the politicians that say, well, I don't like this woman, she just mentally ill. Who decides that?
So the question, thank you for that. The question is who, during this sterilization frequency, who made the decision about who should be sterilized? That's a very good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Who determines fitness or unfitness?
So the states that had the laws generally had boards. Sometimes they simply gave doctors authorization who were deemed experts on, the biological fitness, and all of them were white supremacists. But I do have to say this though. I want to be clear. Eugenics was so broadly accepted that we found, like for instance, Spanish language newspapers in the 1950s that were supporting eugenics. Eugenics was very popular in South America, Central America. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the talented tenth. He talked about the submerged tenth, and he said that one of our struggles, as it is with every race, is to prevent the submerged tenth from overtaking the talented tenth. And there were better baby contests in the African American community. Dallas Express, a black newspaper in Dallas, black-owned newspaper, sponsored those contests, and they were worried about people migrating to Africa because of Marcus Garvey. They were worried about lynching. They were worried about other factors reducing the black population. But they also had eugenic concerns too. But generally, these states set up boards that would judge who should be sterilized, or they gave it to the discretion of whoever was running the hospital where these people, or prison where these people were detained, because prisoners were a big target of.
If you didn't like a woman, or if you didn't like a man, the community didn't want to do.
So, talking about revenge motives or maybe political motives to have certain people sterilized, what do you think?
There was I don't recall the woman's name, but there was a high society woman who was standing to inherit a fortune, this in California, and her mother wanted the estate, and she used her sexual behavior as an excuse to argue in court to get her sterilized, and she lost the case, and she got sterilized. And this was an upper income woman who did that. So there are those cases where people would charge, and obviously the Carrie Buck family, they had to have known about the sexual abuse, and they had to have been protecting the rapist who impregnated Carrie Buck, and they let it happen to protect the family reputation. So I'm sure that happened, yes.
Is there a history of like Parkland or county hospitals always offering people-ligation or sterilization of lower income or a certain socioeconomic? I thought at one time, up until the 80s or 90s, even maybe 80s, 70s, 80s, where that was an option, but it was rooted in we don't want you reproducing anymore.
Thank you for that. Good question. The question is, did local county hospitals, maybe such as Parkland or John Peter Smith in Tarrant County, did they push sterilization for certain groups?
Yeah. Did they?
That was universal. Yeah, even in states that didn't, I want to be clear that states that didn't pass the laws still saw sterilizations happen. And there were sterilizations of, for instance, rather than lynch a black man, they might castrate him in Texas. That happened. Okay. But generally speaking, people accepted medical authority. And doctors come from a different class position. They come from wealth and privilege, and they're making a judgment saying, can you really afford one more child? And they found in California did a study, and they found that in the 70s and 80s, women would be told, one more child could kill you. You might have, ectopic pregnancy, etc. You don't want to go through that, and so you might want to have the operation. And typically it was women who were poor, who were on public assistance, and doctors made a value judgment. So I have no doubt that that happened. Although they didn't keep records of that, right? But you know, California investigated. We know in other states that that happened.
In California, you said it was happening a lot. What groups were really targeted with pushing sterilization? What neighborhood groups are?
What groups?
In California, what groups were targeted?
Well, okay.
So asking in California, what groups were targeted there?
Same in every other state. They would target poor, working class, people of color, Latinx community. That was particularly targeted. I will say too, the eugenicists had another effect, and we're still feeling basically the hangover from this. Eugenicists really pushed for IQ tests. And there was a UT professor, Clarence Stone Yoakum, who was a psychology professor, who was involved in what was called the Army IQ test. I don't know if you ever heard of this, World War I. They had a great opportunity with all these recruits wanting to fight the Kaiser in Europe. And so they had designed these IQ tests. The designer of the IQ test, the original IQ test, was a man named Alfred Binet in Switzerland. When he designed it, he said, this is a snapshot of how a person responds to questions at this particular moment, but they can be taught, they can be tutored, they can improve. This is not a description of biological trait. It's not a measure of quote-unquote intelligence, whatever that is. Stanford University took that test, modified it, and used it as a measure of a permanent trait like, you know, tallness, weight, whatever. And they developed the IQ test. In the Army IQ test, they assigned mental ages to the recruits, and all their prejudices were confirmed, lo and behold, right? So Clarence Stone Yoakum was involved. The Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans had, you know, mental ages of 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, supposedly, etc. Jewish people, 11-year-olds, you know, etc. Supposedly Jews were mentally deficient, the opposite of stereotype today, right? One interesting thing about the reporting of those results, they found that African Americans educated in the North scored notably higher than whites in the South. So what do you think they were testing? Innate ability? Quality of education. But that didn't occur to the people. So all these standardized tests, they're the lineal descendants of these IQ tests and are loaded with many of the same assumptions. They're culturally biased and they harm lives to this very day. And they make education in many ways a miserable experience to this day. Yeah. So anyway, big impact that Texans played a role. Yes.
Eugenics has been a problem with forced sterilizations for Native American women.
Mm-hmm.
They'll go in and have a baby and
Yeah.
come out unable to reproduce.
Yes.
Did you find that in Texas, or is that more of a more different parts of the country?
Well,
So the question is about Native American women. Did we find sterilization of Native American women?
so here's another example of a bad thing that results in a good result. Texas did not. It lagged behind other states creating the infrastructure that would allow that sterilization of Native American women to happen. You know, the number of hospitals, the number of people who could refer these women to the hospitals, et cetera. That the states like California, you know, Georgia, et cetera, they had developed the networks where people were fed into a pipeline and got that result. So,
You're asking a very, very fascinating question, and this is just speculation, but I wonder if for quite a while if Native American women were giving birth outside of hospitals or birthing centers. So home births, basically. Might be. I don't have any statistics on that, but I wonder.
It was a significant issue in the country as a whole, definitely, and in Mexico, by the way, and many of the countries, and Central America, and that indigenous women were the targets for the sterilization programs. Yes.
So the work that me and Stephanie have been working on for a long time is trying to find historical connections to these contemporary issues. And you briefly mentioned feminism, but I'm really interested in like the Margaret Sanger connection, even Margaret Mead, if we're going to talk about cultural anthropology.
Right.
Both of them have views connected to Genesis, and this current issue around the black maternal mortality rate that we can't seem to solve, but I feel like it has origins in this movement somewhere, right?
Yeah. As someone who defines himself as being part of the left, I find liberals really problematic throughout history. And the progressive movement was the cutting edge of eugenics. I didn't ask one of my questions, what part of the political spectrum supported eugenics? And there were far right-wing people. And the right wing right now is engaged in a very cynical effort to make eugenics something that only progressives and only Margaret Sanger created. She was a supporter of eugenics. More babies from the fit, fewer from the unfit. She said that, and she was part of the project in Alabama to encourage black women to get sterilized. By the way, Du Bois supported that too. One of the weird experiences I had, and I was going to ask Soraya to ask me about this. It was uncomfortable how contemporary so much of the material we were writing about, how relevant it was to the present day. I was writing about this debate in the Texas Medical Journal, 1880s. They published this debate in Texas about is it ever okay? This was a progressive doctor. F.E. Daniel was the editor, part of the progressive movement. Is it ever ethical, given our anti-abortion laws in Texas in the 1880s, to give a woman an abortion? And they came up with one example. If a well-off woman, a flower of society, had been seduced by a cad outside of wedlock and had become pregnant, wouldn't it be the greater social ill to leave her undesirable for all these wonderful, fit, wealthy men who would give her, and she could have lots of babies with that fit man with character? And a lot of the doctors said, that's a case where abortion's okay. And I have to say, with any of these laws, including abortion laws, the wealthy, if they wanted them, they could get them. Yeah. That's part of the logic was, progressives were not exactly like later liberals, but they were the forerunners. And a lot of people called themselves progressives, called themselves liberals when Franklin Roosevelt became president. And here's the logic. If we can better regulate traffic so there aren't traffic jams, if we can make sure that meat's not poison, it's not going to kill you by inspecting meat, if we can inspect drugs so they don't kill people when they take patent medicine, why can't we improve the human species? And it was very much, and it required a belief in a big government with power, a lot of power, right, to do that. And part of the left embraced this. The Soviet Union adopted some eugenics measures. One of the most interesting characters, I think he'd be a great character in a Coen Brothers movie, if you ever saw "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" movies like that. There's a professor at the University of Texas who was a biologist who proved later that exposure to X-rays changes the inheritance of fruit flies, that their children become mutated if they're exposed. And later, they use the language of genes while he's working on this research. That radiation alters the genes of fruit flies. He's a Stalinist at UT Austin in the 1920s, 1930s. He writes a book where he says the only country that's going to be able to really have a great eugenic program today is Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. He writes this book and he says, because eugenics will work only in this way. If we both deal with the physical disabilities and the hardship and the poverty that causes, and the economic inequality, we eliminate poverty, then we can deal. If we do the poverty first, then let's deal on these, because these defects, quote unquote, cause poverty and misery. He was never able to publish that. He hid the book until he moved to the Soviet Union. And he was on leave from UT, and then UT fired him. So it's all over the spectrum. But definitely, no. Progressive history is definitely entangled in that. There's a change. Liberals are, progressives are terrible on civil rights issues. Liberals are problematic, but they're at least more supportive of civil rights after World War II. So did that?
Yeah. My follow-up is the question that someone over here asked about Parkland. So when I moved to Dallas, there were so many stories, not written down, but oral stories about black people going to the basement of Parkland and getting terrible medical treatment. Mm-hmm. Have you read anything about this, particularly when it comes to sterilization or any of these eugenics?
I did not encounter that material, but I suspect that they just didn't keep the records. I have no doubt that it happened. And I haven't found the oral histories yet because, that's the thing with archives, and you know this, Sherry. The archives are put together by who? Well-off white people, right? Who focus on pretty well-off white people. Stephanie, you know those too, right? It's hard to uncover these stories. And I didn't find anything in the, like family memoirs or anything. We looked for it, but we didn't find it. Yes?
So I just saw this weekend there was like a young actress, Sydney Sweeney, who was in ad for American Eagle jeans, and the line is about her having great genes. She's blonde, white, etc. So I'm wondering if you see, like, how you see this impacting the younger generation now. Like, are the messages getting more subtle? Like, what do you predict is next wave of it?
I can't tell you how many liberals have, and I don't want to sound like I'm anti-liberal. I can't tell you how many liberals.
Michael is to the left of everybody you know, except maybe a few people who are gathered here tonight.
But I can't tell you how many liberals have told me, you've got to see the movie Idiocracy, which is a eugenicist film. The idea is that stupid people have, which is the fear that all the eugenicists had, that the stupid, the unfit, because they have no restraint sexually, they're not disciplined, they're not busy creating wealth. They're going to have giant families, and the smart people are busy creating wealth and running businesses. They're going to have small families, and so idiots take over the planet. And that's, liberals say, that explains the Trump era. Which is interesting because if you look at all those really wealthy people are really excited about Donald Trump and how Wall Street responds to them. But when you see on the internet the depiction of Donald Trump supporters, it's people in trailer parks without teeth, and so beating up on the poor who are actually the least likely to vote, while ignoring the perfidy of the wealthy, really is American politics, and that's the problem. So I think it's what we have that idea, and I think a lot of the dating. I didn't mention this, but there was a California eugenicist named Paul Popenoe who had a column in Ladies, was it Better Housekeeping?
Ladies Home Journal.
Ladies Home Journal. For decades, he wrote a column called can this marriage be saved?
Yes, I remember that.
I do too.
He went from being a eugenicist to writing that column, and a lot of the eugenicists post-Holocaust, when they stopped calling themselves eugenicists, but they were doing the same thing, they went into marriage counseling. They went into couples counseling. They said, do you really, I don't know if you guys are well matched, but, if they're both, quote unquote, smart or both, healthy and everything, oh, you guys would be a perfect fit. And they used that expertise, and their ideology didn't change, just the language did. Did that answer? Yeah. Paul Popenow. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
So, any other questions? Going. Alan?
I'd like to see if you push this further back in history and wondered what the relationship is between racism and eugenics, particularly in regards to the way that, for instance, out of white mixed marriage was classified very carefully.
So, Alan's question is, how far back did we go in examining the role of racism in pushing eugenics, and I guess the intersection with prohibitions for so long on what were called mixed marriages? Yeah.
Or classifying, quadroons and
Oh,
you know,
yeah, classifying who's a quadroon and
Right.
terms like mulatto and
Right,
so
exactly.
forth. Yeah.
Well, every group almost on the planet had a eugenics program. We have to acknowledge that. Like I said, it's all over Latin America. Africa was colonized, so they were having racial policies imposed on them, right? But as I said, the African American culture, there's a slice of that in their culture. So a lot of times, eugenicists in non-white cultures question the white supremacy, but the class politics was there. Do you know what I mean by that? Like the menace posed by the wealthy, or the menace posed by the people who are poor, who are assumed to be poor because they were supposedly defective. That was a big element. I found we talked about a novelist, a black novelist who was both in Texas and then Tennessee, who has a character who says, he's talking to a wealthy white man, and he's he's a successful black man. He says, we have the same enemy. This white trash is really dangerous. And, if we're going to prevent black people from voting, why don't we let the best black people vote? And why don't we only let the best white people vote? And so we can unite based on class, and let's set aside this pure white supremacy things, because those white people really, and that phrase white trash is so embedded in the culture, and it implies that if human beings are trash, what do you do with trash? You dispose of it. They're garbage, right? Which is sort of what happened in Auschwitz, and right, certain human beings are trash, right? And that's been, that concept of the inferior white has been part of American culture since 1600s in Virginia and Massachusetts, all the colonies. So that's an element there. There's a real link to white supremacy, but it doesn't necessarily require white supremacy. But the white eugenicists were to a person, and I would set the man I mentioned, Herman Joseph Muller. He was actually an anti-racist, and he was a eugenicist. He said race is not a real thing. But he's the exception. He was very unpopular with the other eugenicists. And he actually almost got run out of a conference when he made that argument. He said, we got to redistribute wealth, because that's causing a lot of these supposed traits of unfitness. Is they're malnourished, they're growing up, and they're getting injured at work. Blindness is caused by. By the way,
Linda's got a question.
I was just going to say real quickly, one eugenicist that might surprise you was Helen Keller, by the way, part of the program. Yeah. So Linda, yes.
So I was wondering if y'all have an academic network of anti-eugenics communicators, and during research
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He wrote a book that's 800 plus pages.
Repeat the question?
Linda wanted to know if there's a network of anti-eugenics communicators, speakers. Yeah, there's a journalist who wrote an 800 plus page book called War Against the Weak.
War on the Weak.
Yeah. And he also documented that IBM was involved in helping the Third Reich during the Holocaust. Not formally, other than eugenicists present papers together and everything, but I think it's relevant enough now with the natalist conferences and with the because I'll say it, the Republican right is really worried about the fertility of certain people, and they want to promote it, and they're promoting schemes again financially. That's financially reward the right type of people, and let's keep people who are garbage out of the country. That the language could be written by the classic eugenicists like Madison Grant, people like that 100 years ago.
Can you explain the title and the cover? Because it looks like you're cutting up a boy.
Yeah. Okay. The phrase "the purifying knife" came from that doctor I referred to in the 1850s, Gideon Lincecum. He said that we need to apply the knife of purification in order to improve the human species when he was advocating for the sterilization laws in Texas in the 1850s. Okay, this is a Better Baby exam. Doctors would participate in the Better Baby contest, and to be clear, if you went to these contests, Fitter Family, we found, by the way, a family that won the Fitter Family contest twice, and the man, the patriarch of the family was a postal clerk in Bexar County near San Antonio. We've got a picture of them, and we were the first people to identify who he was, because there's an archive. But anyway, he won twice. You go there, they measure the length of your skull, the shape of your skull, the angle of your forehead, all these other traits that were supposed to correlate to racial superiority and fitness. And people would submit their children, and the whole family would, and they'd rank you. They'd give you scores. And just like, elsewhere in the fair, they're going to give a blue ribbon to the fattest cow or the fattest pig or whatever, and you win the blue ribbon prize for that. They do the same thing for the human babies. Because and the eugenicists who organized these contests actually said, it's just like animal breeding. So that's what's going on the cover there.
Yeah, and he's not actually cutting on the baby.
That's a caliper.
He's using calipers to measure the skull or different parts of the baby.
Let me guess. The winners of the Better Baby contest were always Scandinavian.
Well, I looked at the Dallas Morning News stories, and they would describe, and they would say flaxen-haired, and
Nordic.
Basically Nordic, quote unquote. Yeah.
American Eagle Outfitters models.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Anybody else thinking about grabbing food tonight? Anybody?
Last call for
food.
Last call up here.
Drinks at 5.
Drinks, order drinks. This is last call for food, which is delicious. If you haven't tried it, you should.
By the way, I ordered some.
Oh, you got,
it's right over there. Thank you.
Let's hear it for.
So any other questions? Our books are available here. We're asking $37, and we got to cover our expenses. And you can do it by Venmo, by cash, or by check, and we'll autograph, and we'll even write nice things in your book. So.
Talk about my Better Baby.
All right.
My flaxen hair.
Oh yeah. Oh, we don't have a credit card reader.
Oh, okay.
So Venmo.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. But can I use my Apple Wallet to do that?